I'll pick up the story in Genesis chapter 5, where Katie left off, with verses 29 through 34. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the year 1493, a publication called the Nuremberg Chronicle painted a picture of a depressed and despairing Europe. On the one hand, the Chronicle contained beautiful engraved descriptions of the major European cities. But on the other hand, it described a civilization with little vision or hope. The publishers actually left the last several pages blank, inviting readers to record on them, quote, "the rest of the events until the end of the world." The society from which the Chronicle emerged existed on a knife's edge of tension. Europe at the time boasted glorious cathedrals, artists, and universities, but it was also a society that had suffered plagues, the breakdown of the feudal order, and a hypocritical and corrupt church that was growing increasingly irrelevant. But right around the time the Chronicle was published, something happened that changed everything. And for the next 50 years, more innovation occurred in every field of human endeavor, art, medicine, astronomy, communication, and religion than has happened before or since, with the possible exception of the time in which we live. Now, most historians widely attribute the rebirth of the human spirit that we now call the Renaissance to a renewed interest in learning and an overall increase in human knowledge. But there are some who propose the actual cause was something totally different. It was the imagination and courage of the great navigators who set out from the shores of Europe and eventually discovered the so-called New World, a discovery that completely reoriented and transformed the way Europeans understood themselves and the world they lived in. The stories in the book of Genesis are stories of individuals who find their lives and their world completely reoriented and transformed, but not by intellectual or geographical discoveries, by the call of God. The stories about Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, take up nearly half this book, following Jacob's life from conception to death, and we come to know Jacob as well as just about any other biblical character. And like Europe at the end of the 15th century, Jacob is a mess of contradictions. Frederick Buechner writes about Jacob, "The book of Genesis makes no attempt to conceal the fact that Jacob was, among other things, a crook. What's more, you get the feeling that whoever wrote up his seamy adventures got a real kick out of them." Jacob's crooked ways are apparent from the very beginning. Even in the womb, as Melanie talked about, Jacob and his twin are at odds, so much so that their poor mother hit her wits' end with their bickering before they're even born, much less old enough to talk. Rebekah asks God, "What is going on?" God responds that these children will usher in an era of division and conflict, for the older will serve the younger. This pronouncement violated not just cultural practices, but laws which dictated that the oldest child receive the majority of the inheritance. That's why it's a big deal that Esau trades his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. For Jacob to get the birthright means he gets the family land, the family name, the family reputation. After Esau parts with his birthright, all that's left for Isaac, their father, to give this beloved firstborn son is a blessing. The same blessing God gave to Abraham, and Abraham passed on to Isaac. But in the very next Genesis story about Jacob and Esau, Rebekah and Jacob scheme to ensure that on his deathbed, Isaac unknowingly pronounces God's blessing not on Esau as he intends, but on Jacob. What makes Jacob such a scandalous figure in the Bible is not just that he overturns laws and customs by getting birthright and blessing, even though he is second born. It's how he does it, through trickery and deception. Jacob is hardly a figure we would want our children to emulate. But as Walter Brueggemann observes, if Jacob is a scandalous challenge to his world, then that is because the God who calls him is also scandalous. From the very beginning, not just of Jacob's story, but of pretty much every story of our religious ancestors, God reveals a fundamentally scandalous nature. And this nature is woven into the people and the world God created. We see it play out again and again. A small British colony revolts, declaring its independence from the British monarch, and goes on to become a worldwide superpower. A young Baptist preacher becomes the voice of a movement that uses nonviolent resistance to fight for civil rights for people of color. A 15-year-old Pakistani girl claims her right to education and is shot in the head by the Taliban on her way to school one day. She survives and goes on to become the youngest ever winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Then, of course, there is the example that proves God's scandalous nature once and for all, Jesus of Nazareth, who came not as a great warrior to overthrow the oppressors of God's people, but who was born in the usual way, to unmarried and uneducated teenagers. When Jesus began to preach and teach about God, he spent time with people who were not just ordinary, but downright scandalous: tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners of every kind. When Jesus' behavior got to be too much for those in charge, he was put to death by crucifixion, the lowest and most humiliating form of execution of his time. Yet our tradition proclaims the absurd and scandalous truth that it is here, where the God of heaven and earth hangs suffocating on a cross, that we most clearly see God's nature. Now, we can get behind this story. We can get behind a story like Jacob's, which shows how God overturns cultural norms and subverts injustice. But we should be honest. We mostly like the idea of a God like that when we find ourselves on the wrong side of injustice. We hear Jacob's story and we think of times that we have been oppressed, maybe because of race or age or gender or social status or sexuality. And we find ourselves rooting for Jacob as the underdog who doesn't get a fair shake at life simply because he was born a few minutes after his twin. But as we follow Jacob's story, beyond all the scheming and deceiving, we find that it doesn't end with blessing and birthright. Jacob must encounter the question we all have to face in such circumstances: what we do when we recognize that God's blessing and promise is ours, in spite of whatever our culture tells us. Near the end of the first act of the musical Hamilton, the colonists defeat the British in the Revolutionary War. The number called the Battle of Yorktown ends with the defeated British slinking away, singing over and over in utter disbelief, "The world turned upside down." Particularly as an American watching or listening to this, it is excited and gratifying to see these upstart revolutionaries throwing off the unjust British rule. But the brilliance of this musical is that the first act doesn't end there. Instead, King George returns to the stage asking some pointed questions of the newly independent colonists. What comes next? Now you're freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? You're on your own. Awesome. Wow. Do you have a clue what happens now? Oceans rise, empires fall. It's much harder when it's all your call. All alone across the sea, when your people say they hate you, don't come crawling back to me. Now, the letter we heard from 1 Corinthians is written by the Apostle Paul, and he's addressing people who weren't involved in nation building, but church building, which is just as complicated, if not more so, given that the church is supposed to reflect the nature of the scandalous God we worship. Paul founded this particular church in the cosmopolitan port city of Corinth, which meant it was a wildly diverse community, as churches worshiping a scandalous God should be. But it didn't take long for this church to become mired in conflict, because even though the people had been taught by Paul that in God's eyes it didn't matter their background or their skin color or what religion they had been taught as children, they were all the same. But they still looked at each other and classified each other the way they had learned to do outside the church. Which is why it's good to read 1 Corinthians alongside the story of Jacob. Because although we like to see ourselves as Jacob, the underdog, Paul's words to Corinth about the scandal of the cross remind us that we must also ask ourselves how we are like Esau, set to receive birthright and blessing without question. Not because we've done anything to earn or deserve it, but because through some accident of birth, we have what our culture happens to label as valuable: a certain skin color, gender, educational attainment, social status, not to mention all manner of material wealth. 1 Corinthians reminds us that sometimes we are Esau and sometimes Jacob, but that we are all inheritors of a scandal, the same scandal that allowed Jacob to take God's promise and God's blessing. But Jacob will quickly learn that this inheritance is both a gift and a command. God's original blessing to Abraham is this: I will bless you, and you will be a blessing. The scandal of God's blessing is that it calls us to bless others. We are blessed to be a blessing. The journalist Ann Helen Peterson recently traveled to Dallas, Texas, to report on a ministry there that is engaging churches in supporting the many refugees that find their way to Dallas. Near the end of her reporting, Peterson spoke with a local pastor about his church's involvement. It's nice that you're doing a piece, he told her, but we need to challenge our nation to do more than read. People in our communities are afraid. Their fear locks them up. But as a Christian, I am guided to live a life filled with sacrifice that adds value to others' lives. To do that, you have to open yourself up to God and to the idea that God might be saying something that you don't want to hear. Because sometimes when you're so assured of your own righteousness, it can be difficult to hear. So ask yourself, are you prepared to see things differently? Samira Page, who founded this ministry, is a refugee herself who came to America from Iran and then converted to Christianity and eventually went on to become an ordained minister. I grew up during the war between Iran and Iraq and experienced war in ways no child should, she says. I remember being young and terrified. Because of the sanctions against Iran, there was no medicine. My uncle was a soldier at the front where Saddam Hussein used chemical bombs on the Iraqis and Kurdish people, and he came home covered in blisters. He died a horrible death after 9 months of suffering. Growing up, I hated Arabs, and I hated Iraqis in particular. Then I came here and became a Christian and started this ministry, and the first family of refugees we had was a family from Iraq. When that Iraqi family arrived at the airport, the mother immediately walked up to Paige, arms open, and said, "Hello, my sister." In that moment, something broke inside me, Paige recalls. God healed me, and all the hatred and anger just vanished. But I was really embarrassed. I said to her that I was a Christian, and my first duty as a Christian was to love, and I hadn't been sure that I could do it. At the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis calls us to see things differently, to recognize that God is not bound by the cultural norms and divisions that so bind us. The scandal of Jacob's story is not just that God overturns cultural norms, it's that God transforms our understanding of what it means to be blessed. Jacob may have thought he was tricking everyone, including God, when he stole birthright and blessing, but in the end, he learns there is no escaping the promise that every single one of us belongs to God. No matter what trickery and deception we employ on ourselves and others, we cannot deny that promise or escape the responsibility that comes with it. We are blessed to be a blessing, not because we are smarter or more capable, but because God's blessing is the birthright of all God's children. God has no interest or regard for our categories and rules about who gets what and how and why. God bestows grace on the best and worst among us, and even on the best and worst within us. That is the good news of the gospel revealed on the cross, and nothing could be more scandalous. Amen.